So welcome back, everybody. We will make start. I'm thrilled to have Leigh Landy here presenting today our keynote for our NoiseFloor 22. I think everybody must know Leigh, so I'm not going to spend too long introducing him. He's got two pieces. If you were here this morning, he had one composition played today. He's got another in the last concert tomorrow evening. And today he's going to give us a talk about our theme based on tradition. So I'll leave it over to Leigh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you to both of you, Dave and Mark. Again, since I'm being streamed, other people can hear that too. I think it's wonderful that you gentlemen take the trouble to put this together every year. It's been going for quite a while, and you know, you've got yourself an international reputation now. But where I started my discussion about my piece this morning by using expressions, the expression about London buses all coming at the same time comes to mind, given the fact that Sonic Junction is taking place at Sheffield on the same days, and all those people should be here. And of course, the Trevor Wishart celebration starts tomorrow, which overlaps with your second day, which is just, again, just totally unfortunate, because it'll be weeks before anything else happens that's exciting. So congratulations to you both, and thanks ever so much for the invite. It is my tradition to try to honor the host's theme or statement or what have you as best I can when I'm invited to offer a keynote. And I'm going to do it rather blatantly by only reading two things from the PowerPoint. My abstract, because I'm assuming you haven't memorized it, so I'll remind you of it. And I'm also going to read their call, be it fragmented, just like my piece this morning, because I thought their call was extremely intelligently put together, asking major questions, none of which I'm going to answer, but I am going to provide you with one thought and one thought only. And I think it'll be pretty clear as time goes on. So, art for art's sake versus art for life's sake, there's no need to avoid tradition within innovative sonic creativity. Here's the abstract. Having undertaken my studies in the 70s, I experienced several radically innovative initiatives within music where one might speak of forms of antithesis departing from music's thesis, that is, music as it had been known globally for centuries. These departures included the exclusive use of dissonance, any sounds as musical material, and of course, Cage's various forms of emancipating music from its rules. The Me epic that followed my student years, again, largely involved antithetical musical languages. Given the marginalization of many of these approaches to music, this talk offers the thought that one might consider Hegel's third phase of the triad, synthesis, as the way forward. A logical consequence of this consideration would be to optimize the combination of art for art's sake with its partner art for life's sake, where including lived sonic experience forms part of a composer's mix. This talk, based on my personal experience and a recent book on the music of sounds and the music of things, written with John Richards, proposes that innovation does not need to disappear when combining the known with the unknown. This leads towards the further suggestion that working sonically within sampling culture, as I do, and within Richards' DIY culture, might lead towards new forms of 21st century folk music, a music of the people, that is, a variety of communities of interest and of practice, as opposed to elite music made for micro-communities of specialists, although there is nothing inherently wrong with that. So what I'm going to be doing is mainly, as I often do, some of you know this already, offer food for thought through primarily storytelling. And through the experiences of the stories, and by the way, John Cage, as you all know, loved to tell stories. Morton Feldman with whom I was even closer than I was with Cage, did that nonstop as well. So if one thing rubbed off on me from those two, it's storytelling. The talk will have something about the topic and its title. Then I'm going to talk about synthesis, and I thought I'd make an in-joke, but by now we've had two really wonderful, three wonderful synthesis pieces. So on synthesis, and I do not only mean sound generation, or how I came to this topic and these views. Then the need to do something about this state of affairs, which I think will clarify itself since that's the heart of the talk. And then a couple of added things at the end, also linking the tradition theme to the two pieces I chose for the program, one of which has already been performed. So why this topic? Well, NoiseFloor's theme on tradition raises lots of issues. Many student composers, and sadly we don't have that many students here right now, are trying to find themselves. And interestingly, through either how music is taught in higher education or where their head is at, maybe they're celebrating a musical adolescence as they start to compose, reacting against, finding a voice, an individuality, etc., etc. I'm not saying that this is universally the case by any means or measure, but certainly in my day that was almost enforced. So where does tradition fit into all of that? I shall return to this. And furthermore, I'm actually really interested in this topic. For those who do not know my work, most of my writing is about why this music is not reaching the audience that I believe that it deserves. And to engage with that subject, we have to engage with antithetical languages, antithetical methods. How can they reach a public? Or, alternatively, can they reach a broad public? So let's get going. I have made an assumption in this talk, and if this does not resonate with you, then you're not going to appreciate the rest of it, I would assume. People at this event are interested in originality and moving music forward, regardless of the genre of music that you're making. So to deconstruct the title, it starts with art for life's sake, and art for art's sake and art for life's sake. In 2011, I keynoted the Electroacoustic Music Study Network conference in New York, where I didn't use life's sake, I said art for goodness sake, which was nicely ambiguous, as in, for goodness sake, why don't you think of your public? But as an antithesis for art's sake. What do I mean by this? Well, this is a gross simplification, because if I'm going to give a food for thought talk, it's going to be rhetorical at times, so I may overstate the case. I would suggest, in the simplest of terms, that art for art's sake is turning art from an emotional aesthetic experience to an intellectual aesthetic experience, primarily, if not solely. We can argue about that later, but I'm just planting my thought now. Art for life's sake, on the other hand, means there must be some artistic connection with lived experience in order to create a communicative loop with people who are listening to music. So that's where my art for life's sake comes from. You could say it differently. Stefano Di Giugno, the guy who made the 4X computer for Boulez, once said to me that in his career he always found it frustrating because he was working with one of two types of musician. And in the case that he spoke of when he told me this little anecdote, he says, "You know, Leigh, I've been working at an earcom for many years, and I'm working with two guys, Pierre and Luciano." So we're talking about the two top European doggies of music, more or less. Boulez, la testa, è vero, he likes to be loved, il cuore. But somehow they don't want to use both. A gross simplification. He'd heard a concert where I was working at the time. Leigh, thank you so much. You gave a concert where I had a combination. That's what we need. That was the greatest compliment I ever got in my life. Because I'm not suggesting that we want just art for life's sake and just address the heart. Because turn on Radio 1 in this country, you can get it day and night. You can earn a fortune for it, or you can fail. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I am suggesting is there's nothing greater than an intellectual kick in music, and there's nothing greater than an emotional kick in music. So why not do both? And if it's going to be innovative, the intellect is not absent. You can't do anything innovative without thinking it through. So that's the first half. The second half is there's no need to avoid tradition within innovative sonic creativity. My hypothesis, good people, is that to reach the synthesis of that Hegelian triad, tradition is going to creep up its little head inevitably somehow. So, Mark and Dave, you wrote, tradition, in a quotation often attributed to Gustav Mahler, is not the handing down of ashes, but the preservation of fire. I'd never seen that before. That's wonderful. John Cage, by contrast, famously talked of creating music free of individual taste and memory, of the literature and traditions of art. Are we preserving fire or handing down ashes, or are we simply trapped by our own individual tastes and memories? Well, in fact, John Cage is suggesting that we should not trap ourselves. And John Cage represents many of those forms of antithesis. I have to say at this point that John Cage, as I will say later, is one of the most inspiring people I've ever had the pleasure of meeting in my life. So I'm not here to shoot him down. But there are many questions that get raised by being totally under the shadow of Cage, which I hope to clarify during this. The Mahler one is complicated, and I don't really have a suggestion at this point. Maybe it'll clarify itself through this talk. Because what is being preserved, and how much fire is there in preserving things these days? It's really genre dependent, it's audience dependent, it's pretty complicated. But you guys were very much right to juxtapose these two. So let's move forward. On synthesis, and I do not only mean sound generation, well, how wonderful to get that glorious piece by Carrie this morning. A wonderful presentation and multimedia piece by Hubert, and the Duplessis piece, and that amazing presentation. None of these pieces were solely antithetical in nature. There was something to hold on to, very much something to hold on to in all of them. And so even though sound synthesis is sometimes, if not often, associated in electronic music with antithetical languages, we have 3 cases within a half a day where there is il cuore, la testa and il cuore combined in these works. So we're searching for new and innovative ways of expression, but we do so within the context of established histories, cultures, and performance practices. Are our traditions guiding us towards the future or trapping us in the past? Well, again, I speak of this adolescence that many of us went through, since there are few students here, of how we're reacting against and how we have to define ourselves and how we have to create something new. I would suggest that with the antitheses that were present when I was a student, it was very hard to create something totally new. Cage had taken us to the limit and beyond. Webern had already taken us to the extreme of dissonance and a sense of time. And I could go on for hours, but I've only got 45 minutes. You get what I'm saying. So I think to myself, there is thesis. Well, no, it is not. There is thesis. There are theses. There are so many different kinds of music in the world. And I suggest here that I make a link to my piece tomorrow, which is about cultural diversity. But there are things that are known. And when people hear things that take a known and take a step further, they've always got the known as a reference point and the step further as the innovation. If we're being antithetical, there's no frame of reference. There may be for us because we're specialists, but for an audience beyond us, that might not exist. And then synthesis. So what is synthesis? Well, I guess you already figured that out. It's taking something experienced with something innovative, putting them together so there's the reference and the step forward, or the steps forward. And I am going to suggest in this talk, maybe that is a really good way forward. Maybe many of you are doing that already. But this is not a philosophy talk, so I'm not going to talk about Hegel, although there's a lot to be said there. I'm just going to use these three words. And if you got what I just said about it, it will carry through the rest of the talk. When I was a student, and that was at Columbia University, for 2.5 degrees, and then to freezing Buffalo for the PhD. There was a lot of antithesis. Although Columbia University has the virtue of being in New York City, which absolutely in my student years was the arts capital of the world, there was an aesthetic brewing there, and with the exception of one composition teacher who was an opera composer, everybody had opted in to a post-serialist, pitch class, etc., aesthetic. And it was more or less expected that we learned that trade. So I did become an adolescent at Columbia University because I went downtown and I heard the young Steve Reich and Philip Glass and Terry Riley and Lamont Young, well, not young, but mid-aged. And I saw John Cage, and I realized there was much more out there than what was being preached uptown. Again, I'm creating a polemic. Things are not as simple as I'm saying. But there was antithesis taking place everywhere except those minimalists, I would say. And the minimalists had great success. Hubert, you had the joy of working with dancers and a video artist. And oh, so many dance companies just ate up Philip Glass like brekkies because that music you could dance on. It was like a carpet. The known was omnipresent in that, even though there was innovation. I'm not getting at the minimalists, but they had vast success because there was lots to hold on to. It wasn't solely antithetical. It wasn't even primarily antithetical. So I'm going to talk briefly about 4 examples from my student years. The first, well, let's just listen to it. Have I got the volume up right? Milton Babbitt. He was at Princeton, but of course the studio was called Columbia Princeton, and the aesthetic between New Jersey and New York had a lot of, what's going on? They're both playing at once. That's interesting. Well, for a young student, that was a brave new world. And I'm not here to write choose your favorite newspaper review of that piece. But one thing was clear. When there were concerts on with this kind of music, the people attending the concert were the staff, the students, and their other halves, or their best friends, some of whom were rather perplexed. Because this music does not connect, obviously, with a broad public. And he did write, who cares? What was it? Who cares if they...
Who cares if you listen? But his real title was The Composer as Fiction.
I know. I do know. I do know. So this is Philomel by Milton Babbitt. And it's a great piece. What always fascinated me about this piece was that it was pitch-based and it wasn't sound-based, even though he had this great RCA synthesizer that he was working with. But it was so much in line with that aesthetic that I was brought up with as a student. Now let's look at a contrast. 4 minutes and 33 seconds. World famous. You don't need to know anything about contemporary music. And most people in the world will know John Cage, but won't know more than one title. And this is probably the one. And when people talk about the piece, they often talk about anecdotes that they've either come up with or they've heard from somebody else. But the main anecdote about Cage is there is no silence. We might know the story about him going into a soundless space, an anechoic chamber, and hearing his blood and his nervous system. But if any of you have been to a performance of the piece, you know you're hearing people coughing and the feet moving about and the the sounds from outside the concert hall. It's conceptually brilliant, and it's making us think. But if you invite your neighbor to a performance of that, there's going to be a lot of talking and like, what's going on here? So I am going to turn the volume down for the third one, because that really wasn't supposed to be played that loud. Xenakis. I had the pleasure of meeting him for the first time as a master's student at Columbia, and he kindly came to my flat with other postgraduate students and listened to their pieces. The piece I played to him was very much influenced by Luciano Berio's Omaggio a Joyce. It was tech sound, something Laura and I are fascinated by, involved with. And he said to me, "Oh, I really like that approach, but I'm really only interested in new sounds." At that time, he really was only interested in new sounds. He would change his view as he grew older. But again, as fascinating as this kind of noise art was, for lack of a better term, if I took my neighbor to a concert of that, there may be arguments. Or if I ask the neighbor, what do you associate this with, you'll hear science fiction and horror films, because that's the only lived context that can be associated with it. The fourth example is December 1952 from Earl Brown, the graphic score that you can see on the right. Earl Brown, to link up with John Dack's wonderful talk, wrote those two available forms pieces. which I think are key works in that world of approach. But this score was bloody well radical for its time. There'd been nothing like it. And the many concerts I've been to of interpretations of this work, one of which he kind of curated, all sound the same. Yeah, they all sound the same. They're dissonant, and they're no beat, and extended instrument techniques, and all that, kind of all antithetical stuff. Well, in the 1990s, when I just moved to this country and I was working at a place called Bretton Hall, most of you won't have heard of it unless you're from the UK, a fantastic arts college, which was a total adventure park in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. I did a project with students on contemporary music course and a popular music studies course mixed for 3 weeks. And we were looking at relevant forms of notating music. So I presented this score to these students, and they broke up in groups and had one evening to put together an interpretation of the piece that they were going to present to everyone else the next day. And 4 popular music students came back, and they, if you don't mind my saying, pardon my French as they say, they took the piss. There was steel drums, there was some rubbish, and they made some utterances. So if you don't mind my saying so, that was by far the most innovative and the best performance of this score I ever heard, because they didn't have the tradition of antithesis and just were going to explore. So I said, thank you for taking the piss. That was the best performance of this piece I've ever heard. Now you think about it. Because you guys are pop music and you don't want to be original, but you were. And that was one of the fondest memories I have as an educator of having that happen, because they taught me something by jesting me. Because that score doesn't have to sound like Philomel or Xenakis. It can sound like anything. I'm sure O'Brien believed that too. We move on. So, a few years after getting the PhD, I had what we call an aha moment, although for me it felt like it was a long time coming. In 1989 at ICMC in Glasgow, I gave a talk that was called, "Is Computer Music Reaching the Public It Deserves?" It was an interesting moment because it was just a talk at ICMC, but it was standing room only. And the person who curated that ICMC put on part 2 of my talk, inviting me and Jean-Claude Risset to sit on stage and talk to the public about the question, is computer music reaching the public it deserves? So people were actually concerned with that. And I decided at that time, it is important, if I believe that the music is too marginalized, or some of this music is too marginalized, that one has to find or discover or research means of connecting with people. Therefore, the ideal would be to increase interest and participation. And my aha moment was that was only feasible through links to lived experience. If you don't believe that, let me tell you the following story. When the Centre Pompidou opened in Paris, I was very happy that I was invited to the opening. And there are millions of people in this building with fantastic exhibits to open the place up. And I just happened to be standing in front of a great Pollock large-scale painting. And a mother and a son walked up to it. And the mother, clearly not from the art world, looked at it like this, and the little boy went, "Mama, mama," and in French said, "There are snakes in this picture." So through the familiarity of snakes in this action painting, the kid connected with it, but the mother didn't yet, because there's no immediacy unless you're open to that. And that was very significant, because that kid got it right. If I can't connect with it, what am I going to do? So I also thought, you go to a restaurant, somebody offers you something to eat, and it doesn't taste like anything you've ever had before. What do you say? Do you say the normal thing you say at a concert? Oh, that was interesting. Or do you say, I don't know how to describe this? Or you say, I liked it, but I don't know what it is. Or do you immediately not like it because you can make no association with anything else? That's what this talk is about. Links with our lived tradition, lived experience. And so where does tradition fit in? Well, tradition fits in because our traditions are what we know. People who aren't religious don't know religious traditions. People who are religious may know traditions that go way back. So it's individual or it's circumstantial. Tradition is a variable term. And I'm really glad that Dave and Mark chose this theme because it's really spot on. How do we deal with that word? So during that aha moment, I started thinking of potential publics, potential audiences, and even how to get people potentially interested in the things that excite me. A guy named Wenger has written about communities of practice, and many other people have appropriated his term. And I think that's exactly what this whole thing is about, communities of interest and of practice. So in my view, I think we have to acknowledge the need to move in innovative arts from antithesis as a goal as to the incorporation of thesis and antithesis into synthesis, so that we offer people, to use my own term, something to hold on to. If there's something to hold on to is I can't hold on to anything, I think your hit rate with the broad public is going to be 1 in 100 at best. But if there are things that people can associate things with, so that noise with horror films or science fiction, then we have a way forward. So I think this notion of synthesis is something we need to consider when moving forward with innovative practices, combining them with things that people can hold on to. I haven't let go of that term since I created it in the early 90s. So I do believe that this idea of synthesis is very important when addressing the tradition theme. People will not come to NoiseFloor who are basing their work solely on traditions. That's not what this event is about. But what you two have put forward with this theme is, what do we do with tradition? And I suggest we celebrate it innovatively. That is what synthesis is. So, acknowledging the need to do something about this state of affairs, you two wrote, to what extent do we need to examine our own histories in the light of current debates on decolonization and widening participation? I would suggest on the decolonization issue, which is major and is urgent, that we're not as culpable as it might seem, since these traditions are not so deeply rooted, and they are open to cultural adaptation. So I'm not going to address that any further, although that would be a really good subject for a talk. Widening participation, on the other hand, is, in my opinion, and has been, in terms of my practice and my other work, absolutely urgent. Participation in terms of the listening experience, participation in terms of making this. And the rest of this talk is going to address that. I have tried to address this issue in my writing, in my musicological work. To me, as many of you have heard from me before, there is no separation between my scholarly work, my creative work, and my applied work. They are all focused on the same thing. And oddly, at least to me, the methods I employ to write, to compose, and to do educational or outreach work are identical. They're absolutely identical. So I started addressing this subject about connecting with people in a book called What's the Matter with Today's Experimental Music? This was written for specialists and was sort of a wake-up call. What are we going to do about this situation? Or are we going to continue to make work for 35.2 people for our concerts? I quickly, after writing this first book, wrote a second one at the request of my then publisher, which was called Experimental Music Notebooks, which took the themes from the first book but applied them for people in education, ideally pre-higher education, so like high school teachers. How can you help high school teachers to introduce innovation in music to young people and make it interesting and relevant for them? Years later, I wrote Making Music with Sounds. By then, it wasn't just all experimental music, it really was sonic art, or what I call sound-based music these days, which became a cornerstone of my approach to music, that it was for people of all ages, as long as they could make connections. And I also, because I'm so interested in tech sound work, wrote a little book that's online only called Compose Your Words, or it's actually composed with words, which is an introduction of tech sound composition. So these publications were made with the intention of reaching out and making what we know and love relevant. But that can only be done by not solely celebrating the innovative and the obscure, but by making connections with people's lived experience. In the early 2000s, I was involved in the Attention Reception Project, in which we played electroacoustic music to people with no previous experience, people involved in music, and specialists, and looked into how this music connected with them, and gained unbelievable data about potential interest in this music. And what we learned was, where there were lived connections in the music, which puts you closer to the musique concrète tradition than to the electronic music tradition, with exceptions, where it wasn't a case of pure reduced listening where you couldn't identify anything, but there were connections with the sonic material, there was a greater likelihood that people would connect with this stuff from age 8 upwards to 18. Some of you know my article from 1993 called The Something to Hold On To Factor in Timbral Music. There I analyzed hundreds of pieces and found things that were common denominators, both musical and extra musical, that people with little to no experience in our music could hold on to. And it has been proven again and again, because that article has a huge history of follow-ups, that when people can hold on to something, that is an access tool to get them into this kind of work. So, talking about my own music for a moment, I can't do music without it being innovative. It's just not in my DNA. But I now can't do music that's purely innovative, that isn't going to connect with anybody beyond the in crowd. The in crowd who gets happy by having an intellectual hit, but not getting what they just listened to or watched. So I love this citation from Marcel Duchamp. Art is what happens when you take an object out of context and give it a new thought. And that means that since my postgraduate years, sampling has been a common denominator in most of my music. Although I didn't use the word sampling. As a matter of fact, Hubert will agree with me, we were talking more about sampling rates in those years than we were talking about sampling. The idea of using sounds from daily life or sounds appropriated from music, like hip-hop musicians and turntablists do. There are elements of the sounds that people can share. They have that in their own traditions. And through the shared experience with a sound, you can connect with audiences. And that became very, very important to my work. Now, just as a slight aside, I want to mention three people who led me to my vision. And it comes as no surprise, since his name has come up so many times today, that John Cage was my guru, because he was more or less the antithesis of my professors at Columbia University uptown, who opened my mind to so many things, brought me to Taoist thought, which I'm really grateful for. But just like anybody, I was going to have my adolescence at one point, and my adolescence was catalyzed by no one less than Nam June Paik, who was often associated with Cage, who said to me at a dinner, you know, I think Cage, if he believes in what he says, should burn up his scores. Why is he selling 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence? All these radical ideas. Just share your ideas. I mean, it was very odd. I don't know if you know, but Nam June Paik, in kind of mid-career, started becoming an art consultant for downtown New York banks. So he, of all people, should question John Cage about such things. But his point was well taken. That was not anarchism. Peter's editions selling all these scores. And I think I am more influenced by his ideas than he was, because I'm not in the fame game. I never was, and I never will be. And a lot of my compositions are spatial, and you need to be there. So putting them on a medium just ain't going to work. And that's why you don't know my work. I can't even put it on a website unless you're going to download the whole thing and have a 16-channel studio to play it back on. It ain't going to work. So, in any case, Cage is my guru. I subsequently worked for a decade and a half with a French video artist named Michel Jaffrenou. Michel Jaffrenou is somebody who just has a sense of humor, very French, very colorful video artist. Couldn't do anything with sound. I can't do anything with video. Perfect match. We worked together for 15 years at pieces at the large hall of the Pompidou Center and touring around the world. Absolutely magnificent. But what we did was take things from daily life and made art with it. We applied Duchamp, and there was shared experience. And our work has been seen by hundreds of thousands of people. Not that I've become rich or famous from it, but just the joy that people have had joy about stuff that applies the Duchampian thought. But for some crazy reason, in mid-career, I was to meet up with Heiner Müller, the East German playwright. And we would have worked together off and on for over a decade as well. And his influence for me, in the end, was greater than Cage's. Because Cage's opened everything up, but the link to connecting with people was absent. So I'm going to criticize him for that. But I don't blame him, because he was a radical thinker, and he took everything to the extreme, other than getting a lot of money off of Peter's edition. Müller, he was in East Germany, living in East Berlin, and he pushed the Berlin Wall about a millimeter, and everybody in his country knew it. Later in his career, he wrote some really radical stuff. And some of you who might know Heiner Müller's work will know that he did those things. But to be a national hero by slightly criticizing Eastern European government while celebrating it because he was a socialist, I saw the power of contemporary art. It was just taking the known and twisting it. He was Duchampian in an East European sense. And his influence on me was total and irreversible. That without a dramaturgy, you're not going to connect. And so he was indeed a very major influence. Then I got involved in text sound composition, and we've had a fantastic example of that performed just a few minutes ago. Amazing. So as I come towards the end of this, I'm going to perform a short piece, which is relevant to this talk. It's not for anybody. I don't think a general audience is necessarily going to connect with it, but there are other pieces I've done in this vein that I think they could. And, I have to adjust the volume before I do this because it will be too loud. No, we're okay. I hope this is innovative in a sense. I hope it connects with you in a sense. But the reason I chose this piece, Stein's Way, which involves 3 different texts by Gertrude Stein that were, 2 texts written in the 20s. Minimal music written a half a century earlier and much more sophisticated than what came next, but very powerful in content. So maybe this piece says really what I want to say today. Oops, come on, you can do it.
Stein's Way. In case of this,
A story. Subjects and places. In place of this.
A story.
In face of this. Subjects and places. In place of this. And in place of this, a story.
A story.
When the work, and when the work, when shitty work. In place of this, and in place of this. If this.
Places.
Concentrate.
If
in this way, preparations may be undertaken.
To undertake preparations.
Comparative preparations. To comparative preparations.
A considerable factor.
It is a considerable factor in this way. This is a considerable factor to
share in this.
It is a
considerable factor
to have a
share in this.
Another example. The time of the composition is a
natural thing.
And the time in the composition is a
natural thing.
It is a natural thing.
And it is a contemporary thing. The time of the composition
is the time of the composition. In part. And once again following, and once again following, and then following, and then share this, and then following,
sharing.
This is a considerable factor in this.
It is a considerable factor in this to share in this. There is
singularly nothing that makes a
difference
except that each generation has something different at which they are all looking. By this I mean so simply that anybody knows that
composition
is the difference which makes each and all of them
different from other generations.
And this is what makes everything
different.
Otherwise,
they are all alike,
and everybody knows it because
everybody says it. Usually one, unusually two, unusual two,
usually two,
use one, and if
two, use one, and if
one used to use one,
and if two,
not only used to use two,
and if two,
there were two,
and they
used to use two,
for the comfort of it,
and the comfort of it,
and
to imagine
the comfort in it.
No one is
ahead of his or her
time.
It is only that one's
contemporaries
who also
creating their own time refuse
to accept.
For
a very long time, everybody refuses,
and then
almost without a pause, almost everybody accepts, don't they?
Not a guess and
guessing, not to guess, not to be guessing, guess and guess and guess again.
Not a good guess.
To guess.
Everything is
It's the same except
composition. And as the composition is
different and always going to be different.
everything is not the same.
And
That is all. Stein's way.
Oh, go on. So to end, we've heard on the air, sorry for the people online, which treats this theme by taking people's daily lives and recomposing them and presenting them in an artistic way, which is exactly what Duchamp is talking about. It connects with people on several levels. People in Ireland and Northern Ireland are going to have very many connotative experiences. Some are very dark in that piece. Anglophones will get a different experience off of it. And in foreign countries, I put up translation videos. Tomorrow's concert has a piece called E Pluribus Plures, so from many, which is not sound-based music, but music-based music. So in this case, I'm taking world music, much of which is in threat of going to be extinct. And I'm suggesting for the world to be a safe and happy place, let's celebrate cultural diversity instead of trying to annihilate it. And in that piece, I'm dealing with tradition innovatively. And it has a big political message as well. I suggest, to end, that through synthesis, celebrating the combination of innovation with tradition sonically, new potential forms of participative 21st century music can evolve. I think we as composers should work as collaboratively as we can, and that the old métier of composer be rethought. John Richards and I have completed a book called On the Music of Sounds and the Music of Things. In this book, we suggest that the commonality of experience with sound and with DIY culture, which is growing ever so rapidly, and introducing fantastic artistic adventure with things from our daily lives. We can connect with people of all ages and all stages. We can be professionals, but we can work with people just starting out and discovering. We can collaborate, or we can do things sequentially as we do in sampling culture. These are options for us all. So, is it art for art's sake? I vote no, but we can't live without it. Is it art for life's sake? I bloody well hope so. Is it both? Why not? Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have some time for questions.
It's better as pop talk. In which case you're most invited. Yes, in the back.
Thank you for the awesome talk. About your music that plunders other people's music, other samples, publicly available things. Could you comment on? Well, there have to be legalities involved in that. As I was listening to On the Air, I thought, wow, much of this is copyrighted, and that you used the word.
Small correction. Almost all of it is illegal.
It? Yeah, and therefore, I mean that puts you at a sort of a disadvantage, because there are places where, if I came across that piece on YouTube, I would be like, this is fantastic. I love it, and for those reasons, it can't go on YouTube.
Well, the first piece in the series is called Oh la la radio, because I was asked to plunder an archive by the GRM in Paris. And I decided to plunder radio broadcasts, because the GRM is part of Radio France. So we collected, I don't know, 24 to 30 hours of diverse French radio broadcasts, and I remixed it into an 8-channel, 10, 11-minute piece. And Daniel Turgougi, who was then the director of the GRM, he was also working for INA, the National Audiovisual Institute of France, because GRM is part of that. And he said, "Disaster! Your piece is totally illegal. We cannot put it on our CDs." They did broadcast it 3 times, which was a risk. So there is a question of risk. In a sense, it is a political piece. All of them are, except the Czech one, because Czech radio owns the rights of all the broadcasts. So they said, do what you like. And you do know that John Oswald was given the Nonsuch archive to plunder, because his pieces were illegal until that happened. And, you know, the rest is history. So I'm taking a calculated risk, and I think the risk is worth taking, because the copyright law on this stuff, one of my pieces is called The BBC or Not, and the head of rights at BBC called me up because he knew Tarugi and said, oh, everything in that piece is going to be illegal. For the Brits in here, John Humphrey's voice. He was still on Radio 4. Big Ben, the pips at the hour, and so on and so forth. There's copyright on all of it. He said, just so you know, your piece is going to be totally illegal. And I said, wouldn't it be great if a professor of contemporary music were locked up for challenging copyright law? Fortunately, our music is so marginal, it ain't happened yet. But the audience to which these pieces have been played, because anybody can enjoy it, have been remarkable, because people come to me and they have individual connections with the piece. And this is what this whole talk has been about, making connections. They have individual connections with the piece. And because of these individual connections, they want to know more. So that's what this whole talk's been about. And if nobody's going to take the risk, because this is inherently a political question, how to move forward with this stuff. And somebody's got to take the risk. So I've done it. But because it doesn't sound right in stereo, I'm not going to release it in stereo. Because what's the point? So that's what Cage and I differ, although he's my guru. Any other questions? Yes?
It's just as an observation, really. So I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts on, we're talking about 20th century folk music.
Yeah, 21st century.
21st century folk music, sorry. But it seems to me, and I've always thought this, that popular culture generally is very good at taking traditions and mixing it with new technology, innovating, moving forward, you know, without academia or anything like that getting involved.
Well, it's interesting. Appropriation is a big word these days. And of course, sampling is a form of appropriation, is it not? Almost every advance in electroacoustic music has been appropriated in popular music, often without any credit given to the sources. Ironically, this idea of sonic sampling cannot really celebrate what it's doing without attributing the success of hip-hop and the like. This is a kind of historical reversal, that the term sample came up in sonic art got appropriated and very successful within popular music, and now is being applied on a vast scale in more experimental and innovative traditions. So, what can I say? It's all porous. Everybody's appropriating from everybody else. The question is, when is the credit given? In my pieces, I will often list all the sources because I've got nothing to hide. I'm not going to get any glory off of the stuff I've just stolen. If we play the copyright game, the question is always, who's going to get the money? And there's loads of literature on it. Do you share it with the original sources? And if you take a piece like On the Air, that would be shared with like 500 people. So then you'd get about 5p each, over the next 5 years, so whatever. But these are very relevant questions, and I think for us, because many of us are in the education game, teaching these questions as contemporary issues is absolutely essential. But what is the function of appropriated material? Because we are acculturating, we're assimilating, we're gathering, we're reordering, we're remixing, we're recomposing, and even in hacking culture, we're repurposing. All this stuff is there, and I think this is of the people. It's not folk music in that there were these traditions that move forward and assimilate culturally. These are sonic opportunities that are shareable with anybody. And that's what I meant by folk music in my statements.
Lovely. Really enjoyed that. I remember you doing, when I was a student at UEA, you did the Gertrude Stein piece for us.
The rock music piece. Yeah, I remember that.
Anyway, what I was going to say was, sort of picking up on what else is going on in the room.
God, that was a wee while ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I think we both had more hair then. But, okay, so as a tradition, only a tradition, if it contains innovation, is innovation the way that a tradition gets to be a tradition, rather than just a box of dead things at the corner?
Well, I'll become John Cage for a second. There are a lot of aspects of this world that like to stay the same. There are many aspects of this world that like to become different. Most of us in this room like things that like to become different. So some traditions get stuck. I wouldn't want to live in Afghanistan right now. But there are some traditions that go with the flow of time. And as an artist, we have no choice. Not only to go with the flow of time, but to help the flow of time. So to get back to those examples I cited, John Cage, I think, possibly the most revolutionary artist I've ever had the pleasure to meet. Heiner Müller, on the other hand, I think he was a much more evolutionary artist, that pushing the Berlin Wall, that millimeter. The impact of both is indescribable. Maybe some of you don't know Heiner Müller, but if you don't, you should. Absolutely brilliant author, and very German. But the dramaturgy that he introduced to me, I think is an absolutely essential thing. And of course, dramaturgy is sometimes used as the technique of the artist. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the communicative intent of the artist. And although one could say that Jackson Pollock is to fine art what Cage was to sonic art, I would suggest that the means of connecting to a Pollock are there, as the child discovered. And it's our recognition of that issue that makes the difference between an elitist, antithetical art that Adorno celebrated and a progressive art with resonance that helps the world go forward.
Yeah. Can you see Manoli's got a question online, and then we're going to.
Oh, okay. Manoli, say something so we can know we can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me, Lee?
Can, absolutely.
Great, thanks for the presentation. Sorry I couldn't be there. So question was on how do we trade between originality and banality? We're talking about using traditions and so on. And then isn't there a fear if we're using too much tradition, we're just kind of repeating ourselves and not adding anything new? Is that something that we should be concerned about, or should we just do away with it and just use everything from the past, including sampling and techniques and performance techniques and so on?
Well, as I published more than once, by combining the new with the known, the new sticks out. And then you can discover what's new in the new by relating it to what's known. So even though I'm a sampling artist and I will make whole pieces with stuff that already exists, I can assure you that if there's no innovation in that piece, I'm never going to share it. But if you're going to make new sounds and somehow combine them with sounds that are somehow identifiable, it is the role of the innovative composer to juxtapose them in a way to make those innovative sounds make sense and make people curious to know more about them. So just to have sounds like we had in the Xenaki's case in my talk, which is a very powerful piece. And since we've all opted in, we all may actually like the piece as opposed to finding the piece interesting. But not everybody is going to like it because they can't connect with it. And so it's the means of making connections. And that's why this tradition theme is relevant, because traditions imply established connections that can be communal, they can be national, they can be personal, individual. And I think in progressive art, personally, and I'm not projecting this on anybody, they are a sine qua non. Making something completely innovative for the sake of it will work for the 32.7 people in our normal audience. And if you're happy with that, fine. But to me, that is the end of art. If we train our students to be as obscure as we often are, we're perpetuating the death of an art. And I think there is so much wonderful innovation, opportunity in sonic art that I think making these connections and offering these connections and the idea of even proposing a folk music of sound, that leaves me with a lot of optimism. But it ain't going to happen without connections. And that's where the tradition thing fits in. And maybe we should stop.
I think that's an excellent note to end on, Lee. Thank you. Thanks again.